We spent a lot of 2021 and 2022, essentially before the war in Ukraine, subsumed everything, reporting on a variety of lingering questions and doubts about the veracity of many of the claims that were made and we were told during the COVID pandemic, but also about the policy decisions that were made, whether there was any real basis for having made them, whether the certainty that was asserted about them had any justification, about the lack of transparency and even censorship that was imposed in order to prevent that transparency, the number of questions that still linger about the COVID pandemic, the wisdom of mask mandates, whether the benefits of vaccines were oversold and the dangers hidden, whether schools should have been shut down as they were, whether lockdowns were effective, whether they lied about the use of masks knowingly, and most importantly of all, I think, what the origin of the COVID pandemic was, and whether or not the scientists under Dr. Fauci, who announced at the start of the pandemic that they knew for certain that this came from a natural occurrence and a species jump and not from a lab leak, were deliberately lying. And of course, whether they were denying at all, the question of the origins still needs to be proven, even though there's overwhelming evidence now in favor of the lab leak. Something we were told at the start of the pandemic was so provably untrue that anyone suggesting it was engaged in an anti-scientific and bigoted effort to attack and disparage Chinese scientists. Now, for whatever reasons, this has been all grinded through the dreary partisan culture war where liberals feel compelled to defend government officials and to heap praise on them and turn them into heroes and to shield them from any attempt to discharge their congressional duty to exert oversight over executive branch officials and to, especially with an event this momentous, this consequential, to investigate what happened, even if it's simply to find out what mistakes were made to prevent future mistakes from occurring in future pandemics. And yet they have absolutely refused to do that, absolutely resisted it, suggested that any attempt to even want to investigate or find out more is some sort of bad faith, right-wing or far-right conspiracy theory. Because any questioning of government officials in the eyes, increasingly of Democratic members of Congress, is an unpatriotic act, even though the duty of American citizens, or the right of American citizens, the duty of the American Congress, is to engage in exactly that sort of inquiry. The Republicans formed a subcommittee to investigate the COVID pandemic, as of course they should have done. When 9/11 happened in the United States, there was originally an attempt to insist that George Bush shouldn't be questioned or criticized, but it was a significant enough event that there had to be formal investigations to lay out what happened. Same with the Kennedy assassination, same with any major event in American or global history. The Congress and official bodies of the United States government have to at least purport to investigate, give transparency, and then tell the truth. And Democrats not only have no interest in that, they affirmatively oppose it. They get enraged at anyone who tries to do that. Now, here is a video from today's hearing, and this is from Representative Robert Garcia, who is a Democrat from California, and he was a mayor at the time of the COVID pandemic. He had 6 minutes, like every other member of the committee, to ask questions of Dr. Fauci. And again, even if you think that Dr. Fauci was well-intentioned, even if you believe that maybe he made mistakes, but they were understandable in the wake of the complexity of the pandemic, none of which I think is even viable at this point, but even if you still believe that, you should still then be asking him questions about those errors, about what could have be done better. And instead, like so many Democrats on this committee, almost all they did was use their time not to ask questions of Dr. Fauci, but to heap unfettered praise on him and to express outrage that anyone on that committee or anyone else would even question him in any regard, given that he was the hero of modern science who saved hundreds of thousands of lives, if not more, through his decision making. And if you think I'm exaggerating, let me just show you one example. Here is, again, Robert Garcia from a Democratic district in California, in Long Beach, and near Los Angeles, who has his time to speak with Dr. Fauci, and instead this is what he chose to do.
the world. Vaccines, a vaccine that you and your team helped foster, have saved millions of American lives.
Now, remember, this vaccine that they're now saying Dr. Fauci helped foster was actually a policy implemented by Donald Trump, who promised that there would be a vaccine for COVID by the end of 2020. Everyone scoffed at him. Kamala Harris and others spread vaccine skepticism by saying, I would never take a vaccine developed under the Biden administration. But now that liberals believe in this vaccine and love it, they want to rewrite history and pretend that it was only Dr. Fauci on his own who was responsible for the advent of this vaccine, when in fact the Trump administration announced that they were pouring massive resources into an unprecedented effort to have a vaccine by the end of the year. And everyone said that was impossible, that if there was one, it would be unreliable. And now they're saying that it was Dr. Fauci who did it.
These attacks are ridiculous. Now, even before this committee started, I'm going to point a few things out. Even before this committee started, this same member that just went on this rant introduced the Fire Fauci Act and promoted it on a podcast, saying that COVID was a bioweapon. That is how insane some of these comments are. And I want to quote this. This is a quote from the same member. I don't believe in evolution. These viruses were not making people sick until they created them. They weaponize these viruses to be able to attach to our cells and make us sick. It's a bioweapon. The they created them, sir, is you. They are attacking you and our medical community for actually creating COVID that has caused the deaths of millions.
Now, let me just stop there and say that this is a focus on Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is one of 12 or 14 Republican members of Congress. And I should also note that the idea that the coronavirus was manipulated in and then leaked from or came from a lab in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, far from being a conspiracy theory, which is what they depicted it as being, is now the consensus view of the leading scientific units within the FBI, the Department of Energy, and other government agencies around the world, who believe it's far more probable than not that it came out of the Wuhan lab, one in which Dr. Fauci had invested, had lied about continuously in terms of whether they were doing gain-of-function research, which is when you manipulate viruses occurring in naturally in order to make them more contagious as a means of supposedly developing vaccines against them. But obviously, if you're manipulating viruses in order to make them weaponized or more dangerous, that also has the dual use of developing a biological weapon, as we reported on in the episode that we devoted to the anthrax attacks on the United States shortly after 9/11 in October and November of 2001. We were told at the time by people like John McCain and many others that almost certainly came from Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi biological weapons program. In fact, according to the FBI, it turns out that in their own narrative, it came from the United States government. And at the time we were hearing these were incredibly weaponized forms of anthrax, that these weren't just naturally occurring anthrax. These had been manipulated in a lab to make them fatal and contagious, only for it to be revealed 7 years later that it was the U.S. Army lab at Fort Detrick that was doing that. And of course, they immediately said, well, we were doing this, but only to develop a vaccine. But every time you manipulate a virus, it has a dual-edged purpose, one of which is to develop a vaccine, another of which is to develop a biological weapon. So the idea that it's so preposterous that the Chinese would be developing biological weapons when we ourselves develop biological weapons all the time in labs, and even if you don't believe they maliciously released it, a lab leak is a biological agent that gets out into the world. And though we were told that was such a preposterous theory at the beginning when Dr. Fauci knew nothing about the origins, to the point that people were censored for even asking that question, let alone asserting that opinion, you can now find governments around the world, Western democracies, that will say that their scientists inside the government believe still that it is far more likely than not that it emanated from a lab, specifically the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, let's continue with his insistence that anything that deviates from Dr. Fauci's proclamations is some kind of not just baseless conspiracy theory, but somehow malicious and inappropriate.
And we know that these extreme comments are targeting public health officials across the country. I also want to show you this other comment. Same member who just attacked you. The Fauci-funded Wuhan lab created the virus. This is so crazy and irresponsible. In this post, the same member of this committee is accusing you of orchestrating a global conspiracy to create COVID on purpose just to make people get vaccines. That you've done this, sir. This same member routinely promotes complete misinformation about vaccines and actually has encouraged the routine prevention of vaccinations that even eliminate diseases like the measles. Dr. Fauci, you've brought together our nation and the world's best and brightest scientists to take on COVID and create a vaccine that works. I want to ask you a question. I want to be crystal clear for the public. You brought together the world and America's best scientists. Do you believe that the vaccine that you all helped create and ensure is safe and effective for the public?
Yes, and its track record has proven that.
And do you also agree that it saved hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of lives in America and across the world?
That is absolutely correct. And it's very clear that it's saved millions of lives here and throughout the world.
So that is obviously not a use of congressional investigative functions, which is a constitutionally endowed obligation for them to investigate the actions of the executive branch. That is propaganda to say that everything Dr. Fauci did was correct. Now, here is a exchange with Congressman Jim Jordan, because this to me illustrates the ease with which Dr. Fauci is willing to just continuously lie and deceive. Remember, he's been a creature of Washington for decades. He was the official who managed and directed the U.S. government's response to the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. I remember very well that he was one of the principal targets of attack and critique by various AIDS activists, including the group ACT UP. That's how long he's been around in Washington, and you don't stay around in power in Washington for that long if you don't know how to lie, to bureaucratically conceal and deceive, and he is an expert at this. Watch this exchange.
Do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
Wow.
I think most of the country would find that amazing. I still got 11 seconds.
But look at the facts. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire process.
All right, I yield back.
Now, does anybody just think about your own experience, your own perception? I'm about to show you what really happened, but does anybody actually believe that Dr. Fauci was encouraging people to keep an open mind about the origins of the COVID vaccine? We were told by the scientific community that he essentially runs through his control of billions and billions and billions of dollars of research grants and others. If you get on the wrong side of Dr. Fauci as a scientific researcher, your career is almost over. You can't research anything. His power is immense. And he was getting emails from the top epidemiologists in the world at the start of the pandemic in January and February and early March of 2020 that were insisting that the analysis they did of the COVID vaccine made very clear that a lab leak was far more likely than not. And yet within a week, many of the scientists who were talking to him had gotten together and all signed on to a consensus that was the exact opposite of what many of them told Fauci just a week earlier, announcing in the now notorious Lancet letter that there was absolutely no reason to believe anything other than this occurred naturally, that any attempt to suggest it was made in a lab was a vicious anti-scientific conspiracy theory, and based on that, the American media essentially excluded the possibility of a lab leak, insisted that it was proven that it was naturally occurring, and to the point that big tech actually barred any assertion that the COVID virus was made in a lab. Now, everyone knows that Dr. Fauci was not out there saying, no, we should keep an open mind about a lab leak. Nobody was saying that from the U.S. government or the leading health officials in the United States. They were doing exactly the opposite. Over and over and over. That was one of their main orthodoxies. And the reason was because In part, they wanted to ensure that nobody was blaming science for having manipulated this virus that at the time they thought could lead to the death of millions of people, which they knew was going to shut down the world economy for many months, if not years. But also, in particular, because Dr. Fauci himself, through the Echo Health Alliance and others, had given grants to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to engage in exactly the kind of research that would manipulate coronaviruses. And it's not just science in general, the institute in particular, that would be incriminated in this kind of worldwide pandemic. But Dr. Fauci and the US government itself, they were just as involved in this research as the Chinese were. The problem is that in the United States, it's much more difficult to conduct gain-of-function research because of legal and ethical restrictions on it, whereas you can do it in China. And they did do it in China, right in the city where the pandemic was first discovered. And now Dr. Fauci is trying to say under oath to Congress with a straight face that I was not part of the effort to insist that this was naturally occurring. I was open-minded from the start, he said, that this could have been a lab leak. Here is another congressman who is Rich McCormick, engaged in a highly illuminating summary of the questions about Dr. Fauci and the accusations against him, many of which are proven to be true, these accusations, and others of which are completely unresolved. And the reason I'm choosing to show you this is because it's an outstanding, concise summation of all of the questions about Dr. Fauci and the management of this global pandemic that have never been answered, and for which there's all kinds of evidence to justify suspicions or worse. And even if you don't believe in past accountability, and how could you not, it's vital that these questions be answered so that we can understand how to avoid these mistakes and this corruption in any future crisis or pandemic. Listen to his summation of what the hearing was supposed to look at.
It's been insinuated that politicians, only bloggers, only conspiracy theorists are disagreeing with you. I want to point out that I'm probably the only member of Congress that actually treated patients during the pandemic from the very beginning to the very end of the pandemic, during night shifts in the ER. Thousands of patients during that time. And in 2020, I was censored. My medical license was threatened because I disagreed with bureaucrats. Literally taken off the internet as a person who is treating patients with leading-edge technologies, developing theories, but doing my very best, but being censored by the United States government for the first time, stepping in and taking the place of medical professionals as the experts in healthcare. Any dissent surrounding COVID-19 treatments, mask mandates, and any public policy surrounding the pandemic was immediately labeled as anti-science.
I mean, that is unquestionably true. We all remember this. You were not allowed to question the theory that this was naturally occurring and jumped from species or emanated from wet markets in China. And if you did, you would be banned from social media for at least a full year as a result of this, really one of the biggest disgraces in science and journalism, or in scientific journalism, in decades, which was the publication of that Lancet letter early on that purported to know the origin of the COVID virus without in any way having disclosed the multiple conflicts of interest on the part of those who signed it, let alone the fact that only a week before, in private, they were telling Dr. Fauci that they believed exactly the opposite. Here's some more of those questions.
Watched as public health officials and politicians told my patients what treatment options were best for them, regardless of their comorbidities or their medical history. Despite my education and my training and my experience, my opinions were relegated to conspiracy and misinformation by so-called healthcare experts who had never treated a patient throughout the entire pandemic. This has been a black eye on the medicine and has highlighted why government should never insert itself in between patients and their healthcare providers. The American people deserve to make medical decisions through conversations with their physicians rather than politically motivated mandates. Dr. Fauci, did you ever treat a patient for COVID during the pandemic?
I was part of a team that was
at the NIH that took care. We didn't take care of many of them.
Okay, so not hands-on. Got it. Thank you. Why would I be criticized by a bureaucrat for doing my very best as a healthcare? This is a rhetorical question. But why? Why would the government, who's never treated a patient for COVID, you can read all the things you want, but you're not there. You're not seeing patients.
Now, I think one of the things that this exchange illustrates is so important is you may remember that Dr. Fauci came out and said, I, Dr. Fauci, represent the science. Such an arrogant and self-glorifying proclamation that I am the science. Not that I'm one of the many scientists, but I am the science. So that if you question Dr. Fauci, if you disagreed with Dr. Fauci, you were by definition being anti-scientific, even though there were huge numbers of highly trained clinicians and physicians like Congressman McCormick, but so many others on every level, epidemiologists, scientists in academic institutions, some of whom were part of the case brought against the Biden administration for unconstitutionally censoring dissent on the internet. You had scientists all over the place and doctors all over the place. But ordinary citizens have the right to do so too. And they were trying to make it seem as though every scientist was in agreement with Dr. Fauci. And one of the ways they accomplished that was by excluding from the media discourse any scientist who disagreed, and even by banning them from social media. One of the galvanizing events that happened in 2020 was that Rand Paul had called several scientists, trained epidemiologists and others. Remember, Rand Paul himself was a medical doctor. He had called to a Senate hearing several medical experts who wanted to testify about all sorts of dissent that some of the people in the medical community had about treatments and other aspects of what we were being told. And when he published, Rand Paul, the video of that hearing online on his YouTube account, YouTube banned it. It was a actual Senate hearing in the United States, convened by senators. In fact, by one of the very few medical experts, trained medical professionals in the Senate. And Google decided this cannot be heard by the American people. That's the level at which censorship was imposed to make it appear falsely as though all scientists were in agreement with Dr. Fauci. I am the science, he was able to say. Now, here is a timeline on the proximal origins of SARS-CoV-2, which is just to give you an idea of how early on some of these epidemiologists were telling Dr. Fauci that it looked highly likely that this came from a lab, or that at least it was 50-50 or 60-40 or 40-60, that it was uncertain. This is a week before that Lancet letter was issued, where many of these email authors ended up signing on to the statement that Fauci wanted, declaring the question already resolved. Here is just one email, February 2nd, 2022. Quote, there are possible ways in nature, but it's highly unlikely. Jeremy Farrar tells the virologist who participated in the call that scientific discussion should be limited to a credible group convened by the WHO. After the call, Farrar collected some thoughts from the group and emailed Fauci and Dr. Collins, who is his British counterpart. Quote, on a spectrum, if 0 is nature and 100 is lab leak, I am honestly at 50. My guess is that there will remain gray unless there is access to the Wuhan lab, and I suspect that is unlikely, Farrar said. Farrar also relayed more thoughts from participants on the call to Fauci and Collins. These emails, first obtained through FOIA by BuzzFeed News, were viewed unredacted by congressional staff in camera and reported by The Intercept. And this is one of the most important reports The Intercept has done in the last several years, which is where they did a FOIA request hoping to prove that a lot of these claims and suspicions on the right were conspiracy theories, and they ended up proving the opposite with these FOIA documents, which, to their credit, they published, that prove that Echo Health Alliance, through grants from Dr. Fauci, were in fact doing exactly the kind of gain-of-function research that Dr. Fauci repeatedly denied under oath to Congress he had authorized or in any way been involved in. And then here is from Mike Farzan, the discoverer of the SARS receptor. The RBD didn't look, quote, engineered to him, as in no human would have selected the individual mutations and cloned them through the RBD. I think we all agree. Tissue culture passage can often lead to a gain of basic sites. And then the key part here is in the highlighted part where he says he is bothered by the furin site and has a hard time explaining that as an event outside the lab, though there are possible ways in nature, but highly unlikely. And then finally, this document concludes, so given the above, a likely explanation could be something as simple as passage SARS-live COVs in tissue culture on human cell lines for an extended period of time, accidentally creating a virus that would be primed for rapid transmission between humans via gain of furin site from tissue culture and adaptation to human ACE2 receptor via repeated passage. And so these were the kinds of discussions that were taking place in private that were continuously given to Dr. Fauci in the early part of the pandemic. And then we got the Lancet letter, which is in February 19, 2022, just a week or two after some of these emails I just showed you, where you can see these epidemiologists that Fauci convened were either saying it's highly unlikely it occurred in nature, it seems far more likely that it occurred in the lab, or people saying 50-50. And this Lancet letter, at the earliest stage of the pandemic, obviously when they had no idea what its origins were, issued this letter saying statement in support of the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of China combating COVID-19. And we went over this the other night. The letter essentially says that any attempt to suggest that that lab was in any way responsible for the lab leak constitutes malicious misinformation about COVID's origins. They said here, let me just get this part here. They said, we stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. This is what is so scandalous. I just showed you Dr. Fauci saying, oh, I had no attempt whatsoever on my part to suggest that this was naturally occurring. I was open-minded, and yet all the people with whom he was communicating, including the ones telling him that they thought it was more likely that it came from a lab, magically appeared in the Lancet, engineered by Peter Daszak, who was heavily involved in the research that they were saying didn't lead to the COVID pandemic. Obviously, a huge conflict of interest. Obviously, if you're part of the research, doing gain-of-function research in a Wuhan Institute of Virology, you have a huge financial and especially reputational interest in saying, no, that had nothing to do with this pandemic. It's proven that it occurred in nature, to the point where they say, we all stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. Things that they could not have possibly known, and we know from those emails we just showed you and many more that they did not know, and yet they go on then to say that scientists from multiple countries overwhelmingly conclude that this coronavirus originated in wildlife, as of so many other emerging pathogens. This is further supported by a letter from the presidents of all of these scientific institutions, and then they said, quote, conspiracy theories do nothing but create fear, rumors, and prejudice that jeopardize our global collaboration in the fight against the virus. And you might even recall that one of the ways it was stigmatized to suggest that the virus came from the Wuhan lab was to say it was racist against the Chinese to suggest that, when it was a complete inversion of what racism actually is. It shows you the way the establishment forces constantly cynically weaponize racism accusations to shield themselves from dissent. Now, it doesn't really matter which of the theories is more or less racist. All that matters is which of the theories is true about the origins of COVID, which in turn really matters in terms of, say, preventing a future pandemic or demanding increase in the safety protocols in labs if it were a lab leak, or finding out how to prevent naturally occurring or species jumping viruses, if that's what it were. We of course want to know the truth about one of the major events in our lifetime that had among the most far-reaching implications of any, on par with things like 9/11. And yet, there's very little knowledge of or interest in, on the part of most institutions, this question, and especially that was true for the first 2 years of the COVID pandemic, and in part was because they somehow got people to believe that what was racist was to suggest that extremely sophisticated research conducted by Chinese scientists in cooperation with or with the support of the American government had led to a leak. How was that racist, or at least more racist than the theory that they were pushing down the throat of everybody in the world, which is that the Chinese are so filthy and unsanitary and primitive in their eating habits and in their wet markets that they caused, through the consumption of bats and other sickening eating habits, the release of this virus. Theirs was the far more racist theory. And yet, to stigmatize and ban the alternative theory, they labeled it racist when theirs was the far more racist. Although, again, what only mattered was not what was the racist theory, but what the true one was. Now, just to give you a sense for how suppressed these questions were, it was not until May 2021, a year and a half basically into the pandemic, almost a year and 3 months or 4 months after the Lancet letter, when the government of the United States, the Biden administration, admitted for the first time that they actually didn't know what the origins of COVID were, that there was huge doubt about whether it was occurring naturally, something the scientists in March of 2020 insisted they knew for sure. Even the Biden administration ended up, they didn't know, and therefore ordered an investigation of what really was the origin of COVID-19. And it was only then, on the very day when the Biden administration admitted that they didn't even know, that big tech finally decided that they were going to lift their ban on any kind of questioning of what Dr. Fauci and his band of scientists had insisted on. There you see Politico, May 26th, the same day Biden administration ordered an investigation into COVID's origin. Quote, Facebook will no longer treat a, quote, man-made COVID as a crackpot idea. Facebook's policy tweak arrives as support surges in Washington for a fuller investigation into the origins of COVID. Facebook and Google had banned any questioning of the pronouncement of Dr. Fauci and his crew, even though there was no scientific basis for asserting it and plenty of reason to doubt it. They banned public questioning of it for a year and a half. And it was only when the US government finally said, you know what, this is allowed to be investigated, did big tech then permit the citizenry to question it and debate it. And then in 2023, leading officials of the Biden administration began to admit that they believe not only that there's reason to question the original theory that it came from a natural occurrence, but actually that the most likely explanation is a lab leak. Here from the BBC, FBI Chief Christopher Wray says that China lab leak is the most likely. And sometimes people say, oh, well, the US government wants to blame China to pin the blame on them, when in reality they did everything to protect China from the beginning. And there's no way to blame China for this lab leak because the United States, under Dr. Fauci and EcoHealth Alliance, were helping to fund it. We're highly supportive participants in it. And then finally, the Wall Street Journal, February 26, 2023. So we're now talking about over 2 years after publication of that Lancet letter, reported this, quote, the lab leak is the most likely origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Energy Department now says. The U.S. agency's revised assessment is based on new intelligence. And it even went on to describe how it wasn't just the top scientific researchers at the Department of Energy, which, remember, have some of the best scientists in the world since they're responsible for overseeing nuclear programs, but also the top scientific investigators at the FBI. Both of them have concluded that a lab leak is not only viable, yet it's the most likely cause of the COVID pandemic. So we went from Dr. Fauci engineering a fake and false consensus on the question, to having big tech ban it for a year, to the US government finally admitting that there was actually reason to question this because they didn't really know for sure, to now the official government position of at least many of the scientists inside the US government, many other governments, being that it's more likely than not that it came from a lab leak. And so you have Dr. Fauci sitting in Congress today denying what everyone knows is true, which is that he played a crucial role in forcing this false consensus on the citizenry, on our ability to question it. And obviously, so much of this congressional hearing covered a huge range of other important COVID debates that weren't allowed, about the efficacy of masks, about the wisdom of school closures, about lockdowns, about whether they exaggerated the benefits of the vaccine or hid the harms of it, so much of which is now starting to become proven. And so to watch Democrats sit in this hearing and essentially proclaim that any questioning of Dr. Fauci is unpatriotic and in bad faith and anti-scientific really shows you where that party is in terms of aligning with the US government, demanding that nobody question it. And so much of this is really, I've always said, you expect policymakers with a complex pandemic, a novel pandemic, to make mistakes in their judgment. But so much of this, including all the evidence about how they purposely avoided FOIA, deleted emails, which I showed you in the middle of last week, purposely misspelled names to prevent FOIA requests from finding them, and then acknowledging and admitting this in secret memos, shows that a lot of this was far from well-intentioned error, that much of it was maliciously intended to shield themselves from not only accountability, but free and open debate. And that's exactly what happened, not just in the United States, but throughout the West. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.